Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar to review the National Liver Review Board process. We will begin in about 5 minutes. Thanks. Good afternoon. This is Betsy Gans, and on behalf of the Policy and Community Relations Department, I would like to thank you for joining the webinar today. If you're logging on to the online portion of the webinar, please remember to enter your audio PIN, which appears on the right-hand side of your computer screen, just beneath the phone number. In addition, please put your phone on mute and do not put the call on hold. I'd also like to inform you that this call is being recorded. Here are the objectives for today's call. We're going to review the changes in the review board structure and how the review board will assign exception scores. We'll also discuss what happens to existing scores upon implementation and what happens when members appeal the NLRB decisions. Dr. Julie Heimbach, chair of the OPTN Liver and Intestine Organ Transplantation Committee, will present during today's webinar. Dr. Heimbach, we've unmuted your phone line.
Thank you, Betsy, very much, and thank you to everyone who's calling in today, which I think is primarily members of the new NLRB board. So first of all, thank you for calling in, and second of all, thank you for agreeing to serve on these boards. Obviously, this whole system only works because everybody is volunteering to participate, and if you didn't volunteer, then we wouldn't be able to do this. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. As you know, the NLRB is comprised actually of three separate boards: hepatocellular carcinoma board, the adult other diagnoses board, and the pediatric review board. And of course, the program could appoint you to serve on all three, or each of you just on one, and an alternative each to one. The liver programs that perform pediatric transplants may appoint a representative and an alternative to the pediatric board. So if you don't have a pediatric program, then you would not be sending someone to serve on that board. The term is for 1 year, and you can continue to serve additionally beyond that, but it's a 1 year at a time board. So this, importantly, is happening on April 30th. So we're going live with the NLRB actually at the same time as our going live with the new allocation system, both on April 30th as of today. That's the current plan. Next slide. So to remind you of how the scoring is going to be done. So not only is there a change from going to a national review board with 3 separate boards compared to a regional board with no separate boards, in addition to making that change, the other change we're making is how we do the scores. So previously, of course, we had a fixed score that was supposed to be reflective of the patient's expected waitlist mortality, and it would increase every 3 months until they had a transplant. That is not happening anymore. So under the new system, most candidates who meet the standard exception criteria, we're going to get a fixed score, which is 3 points below the median MELD at transplant in a circle that is calculated. So that median MELD at transplant is calculated in an area that is supposed to be reflective of the environment for that candidate to get a transplant. And when we first did this in 2017, that was going to be the DSA. DSA is really not part of the system anymore, so it's going to be a circle, a 250-mile circle around the transplant program for the calculation of this median MELD at transplant. And of course, going forward over time, if we feel that that 250 miles needs to be revised, we would be able to do that. But right now, going forward, it's going to be a 250-mile nautical mile circle around the transplant hospital. And in most cases, most of the standard scores are going to be fixed to just a little bit below that, which is specifically median MELD at transplant -3. And for adults, that would be true. And for adolescents, that means people that are between 12 and under 18, they would have median MELD at transplant for standard exceptions. Whereas pediatrics, which means age under 12, waitlisted candidates would receive a score that would be equal to a national median MELD at transplant. So that's generally true, and that's generally reflected on this rather complex table that you're seeing in front of you. However, there's a couple of things that would be an exception to that. One is primary hyperoxaluria, which you can see there, and that is median MELD at transplant, not median MELD -3. Well, the reason for that is that these patients actually have always been given a slightly higher score than the other standards because of the need to be on dialysis, and as well as the need to have a kidney with the liver. So that thought was that they would need to have a little bit higher score to be able to access those donors that have both a liver and a kidney that would be suitable. And additionally, you can see that the MELD 40s would still be staying at the MELD 40. And you can also see that for adults with a metabolic condition, there's not a sort of standard MELD exception for those patients. but there is for pediatrics. Next slide. So again, how do we come up with these median MELD at transplant? So this is, again, supposed to be reflective of the area that the patient, the environment that the patient is exposed to. So this is a circle, a 250 nautical mile circle around that transplant hospital. And so for adolescents and adults that are transplanted with a MELD, it's a 250 nautical mile circle. And for pediatrics, that means under 12, that's for the whole nation upheld. However, when we do this calculation, we don't include all of the transplants that are done. There's a few that are excluded, as you can see there, and this is based on the idea that typically candidates who are transplanted using nationally shared donors or living donors, or candidates who get a deceased donor transplant, or patients that are transplanted as a 1B and a 1A, of course, they don't really have a MELD score that we could put into this. So all of these kinds of transplants are excluded from the calculation of the median MELD at transplant, because typically for the first three, we would put them in patients with a lower score than their calculated MELD score. And so people felt that, especially for programs that didn't have living donor, for example, they might be disadvantaged if in certain ways, and those that are using living donors, that would change. So that's excluded from the calculation. Next slide. So in terms of, how do we do our job as the NLRB? How are we going to assign scores? So in many regions currently, the scoring system follows the similar scheme as the standard MELD exception. So in general, many regions would award scores similar to the standards for the non-standard. So a patient that is reviewed by the region and they feel like, oh, this patient needs an exception, they're kind of similar to the other exception patients, they would generally get a 22, and kind of every 3 months they would go up. And so we felt that the NLRB would function in a similar way, and therefore the patient would be generally pegged to the same kind of system that we're using for the standard MELD exception. So what that would mean, that in general, a patient getting a non-standard exception would be getting median MELD at transplant -3. Now, it might be that a program thinks that the patient needs a different score, whether they have a standard or a non-standard diagnosis. It may be that they need a different score. So then they would submit and ask that the patient they want a different score, and reviewers will see how that requested score aligns with the median transplant score. And so unless the center asks for a MELD or PELD 40, you're not going to actually see the number, but you're going to see what the center is requesting relative to the median. So they're saying, I actually think this candidate needs median MELD at transplant +3, or median MELD at transplant rather than median MELD -3. And they would then say why they believe their candidate is more urgent relative to other candidates with an exception score. So then our job as reviewers would be to consider this request in comparison to the policy standard patient, and whether we agree that this patient is a little bit higher risk, we should give them a few extra points because they are having a higher risk on the wait list than the other candidates. So that's basically the plan for how these are going to go. We didn't want them to be asking for a specific, say, I want a 32, because we were worried that that would then identify potentially the region that person was in, because, we would know that that would be a higher area or whatever. And so in order to keep this blinded, we just asked that, the scoring that the NLRB would see would be relative to that median MELD at transplant. And so that's kind of a new way to think about the scoring system going forward. Next slide. And so then what happens after the form is filled out and the score is requested is that the exceptions are then routed to a specific 5 viewers randomly assigned for each case on whichever specialty board is relevant for the case. And the request is reviewed, and we're asking not just for a simple majority, but a super majority. That means 4 out of 5 people would agree that this candidate would have the score. And if the vote does not happen by that reviewer in 7 days, the case would need to be assigned to another reviewer. So everyone will have 7 days to do their votes. We will be getting reminders through that period, and we would really want you to not miss your votes, because this all only works if everyone does their votes. The 7-day time period is actually what we have now under the current system, so this is not a change. The reminder system, I think, is a little bit of a change. It's built in, so hopefully that will make it easier for people. We are going to be monitoring people's performance on the board. We do really need you to do your votes, and if you don't do your votes, after 3 times of not doing your votes, then there would be a consideration about whether we would maybe try to switch to the alternate or not, continue to have that person serve on the board. So it's really important to do your votes. If there are not enough votes done within a 21-day period, and again, this is exactly as the same as current policy, the waitlisted candidate would actually automatically get the score. So this would be slanted in the favor of the waitlisted patient if the board is not performing as they should. Next slide. So again, as we've described, that this is just basically similar to what we already talked about, is that the score would align to that median score, and you should compare this in relative to the other policy standards. Next slide. So this is just important to remind yourselves that there's guidance that is built for most things. So we're hopeful that programs will be using the guidance documents to submit their exceptions, and they will include the required elements. For example, if you're asking for an exception for refractory hepatic hydrothorax, there are specific elements in terms of the number of thoracenteses that the patient should have had and the volume of the thoracentesis and those types of required elements. And if those required elements are not there or they don't meet the standard, then the patient should generally not be approved, because that's why we made the guidance, so that the review board could be consistent and that the programs could have a consistent expectation. And of course, not every single case could be covered by the guidance. There are definitely going to be strange conditions that might still warrant an exception or might not warrant an exception that we couldn't cover with guidance. There are specific things that we discuss in the guidance where the patient should not get an exception. For example, ascites is not an indication for an exception, and that is clarified in the guidance. And so we would hope that unless the patient is having a really unique issue that would warrant an exception, that we would follow the guidance and we would not grant an exception. So that's kind of the role of the exceptions. We have them created for the adult non-HCC board. That's probably where it will be used the most. In pediatrics as well, we tried to carefully go through. We developed these guidance documents by essentially reading several hundred of the sort of different case forms that were put through the pediatric system, and more than 1,000 of the cases that went through the adult board to try to come up with these guidance so that we would cover all the areas that we need to cover. For HCC, it's pretty slim because there's actually not a whole lot to say, because they already kind of have a pretty clear policy about HCC, but there is still some guidance about what could be approached in that area as well. So definitely want you to use this. Probably have to, basically have it open when you're reviewing the cases, just to sort of, until you get really familiar with it. I think it will be helpful. And any feedback at any point that anybody has about this, of course, we very much want to know it on the Liver Committee, because, these guidance documents would be open for us to revise if, additional information becomes available, which it will. There'll be new publications and new evidence that would guide our thinking and require these to be revised. So that's important. Next slide. So this is a really important thing to discuss again today is, what are we going to do with the patients that have already gotten an exception score from the regional review board or a standard score that was granted to them by policy. And so you can see how that is going to be managed on this slide. Essentially, on the 30th of April, every patient with an exception will be generally converted, except for patients who are under 22, as you can see on this table. And what will they be converted to? That is on this table. So what we talked about was many different ways that we could handle converting, and what we ultimately went with was what you can see here. So if a patient currently has a 40, that would most likely be a patient with HAT, and there are very few of these patients on the list right now. They're going to still have a 40 after the conversion, and our aim is to, going forward, patients with HAT would continue to get a 40 unless they met, status 1 criteria. Of course, then they would be a status 1. Any patient that has a current existing exception score between 22 and 39 are going to convert to medium moderate transplant -3. And that's true whether they have a standard or a non-standard that was reviewed by an RRB and was given a score that was 22 or higher. And the thinking behind that was that when we looked at that, we thought, well, if a review board looked at this and they granted a score that was 22 and higher, they felt that this patient's mortality was similar to other exception patients that had a policy-based score that was 22 and higher. So that's why they have that score. Of course, programs could get the median moderate transplant -3 conversion and say, well, that's not enough. This guy actually is much more sick than my regular HCC patient. Then they're going to apply for that higher score, median moderate transplant or median mod +3, and they're going to say why. And those could start coming through, after the go live at any point in time if, people see that they really think their particular candidate is different than all the rest of the exception candidates. So we should be anticipating that. And as we've previously discussed, patients who have the diagnosis of primary hyperoxaluria, which is actually a very, very small number of patients, just basically, between 10 and 20 total per each year. Medium moderate transplant is what that patient will get. And any patient that has a current exception that's less than 22, we thought that the RRB that reviewed that case thought that that patient was not quite as sick as other standard exceptions, which is why they didn't give them a standard exception score, and therefore they would not be going to the median moderate transplant -3. They would just stay with their score. Eventually, when they are going to be reviewed, they'll be coming through at the time of renewal, which would be 3 months from whenever they got their first score. Then this program is going to say, my patient, needs an exception. We would like them to have, maybe they'll say median moderate transplant -6, for example, because they know that the patient is not as sick as other exception patients, and that's why they currently have a score less than 22. So that's something you can expect as the system rolls forward. Next slide. So this just walks through the exact same information, except for how does it handled for the adolescents. And so adolescents, that means age 12 to 17, they're transplanted on MELD, but rather than being -3 for standards, they're going to be medium MELD transplant. So the expectation is that we would use that sort of baseline going forward as well. So they're going to be converted to medium MELD transplant rather than medium MELD transplant -3. Primary hyperoxaluria, again, gets a little bit of extra adjustment. So rather than just being medium MELD transplant, they're medium MELD transplant +3. Otherwise, the less than 22s will not change, and the 40s are going to stay a 40. And then the next one, next slide, please, is just, again, reviewing the exact same table, but with pediatrics. So that means a candidate who is under 12. These candidates are transplanted with PELD, and as you know, PELD actually goes higher than 40, so it's possible that there could be someone on the list with a 40 or even a higher than 40 score, and they would just keep their score. And then the score after the go live for everyone else is going to be automatically adjusted. If their score is less than 40, they would go to median PELD at transplant for the nation rather than for any kind of a circle. And then again, primary hyperoxaluria candidates would get median PELD at transplant +3. And again, the pediatric candidates programs might see their candidate's new score that goes to a medium PELD transplant, and they might feel that it's not enough priority, or I guess theoretically they could think it might be too much priority, and they would ask for a lower score. That would be pretty unlikely, but it could happen. So when it's time for the renewal, they could just ask for a different score, or they could immediately ask for a different score, thinking that they want their patient to have an increased priority. And it just would be important for them to justify why this candidate would be more urgent than other candidates that have exceptions. Next slide. And so then this just reviews for us again, how is our board going to function with appeals? So the same 5 members that got the first request are going to get an appeal. And so the first appeal, just as it is today, comes back through the computer system, the program would see the initial votes and why the program or why the reviewers, all of us said no, and we would put our reason just as we do today. And so the program would see those reasons and the feedback, and they would be able to change their request to include, answers to questions that were raised by the reviewer. Say the reviewer would say, oh, you didn't give us this data, we can't approve it, or where's this data, or, what is this all about? Requesting additional clarification, and then with additional clarification, it might be that we would approve it. And so if 4 out of 5 approve it, then they get the score. If it is not approved, then it would be denied. The program can still say, well, I would like to have a conference call. I want to talk about this. Then the next appeal, just as it does today, would go to a conference call. And we have all, or not all, but many people have been assigned to serve on the appeals review team. So that's a specific time that you're going to be serving. And you're going to be serving for 1 month at a time. And there's going to be a specific conference call that's going to be meeting weekly, and that's already been set up. And you should have already been notified if you're serving, because I've seen the list, and I think it's booked out through October, the people that are serving. So that call, I believe, is on a fixed time. I think it's a Wednesday. But anyway, those details will be forthcoming to those of you that are on the appeals review team. And so, again, in this case, we want that supermajority, so majority plus 1, and the process has to be wrapped up within 14 days. So if for some reason it doesn't happen on the week, it could still roll to the next week, but then it wouldn't be able to go past that. And so these conference calls are at a fixed time every week with the hope that, that would allow everybody to be able to participate that is assigned. And obviously you could have your, if you wouldn't be able to be there, there's an extra number of people assigned so that we have some flexibility with that. If it is still denied by the appeals review team, then a final appeal can go to the liver and intestine committee. So that's how that works, just as it does today. So what do you need to do? So this isn't necessarily for us, but as current regional review board members, it is critical, so bullet number 2 there, that we get all of our reviews done by April 30th. We're asking programs to try to get all of their stuff in before April 23rd, which would give everyone the 7 days on the RRB to still finish this. If something comes in between April 23rd and April 30th, it is still going to be sent to the RRB, and if you're able to get it done, that's great. And if we can get all the cases done, that's great. If we can't, then of course you'll see it again as an NLRB case. So as much possibility as we can to get the cases done when they're still in the RRB phase, that would be just fantastic. And everything else is going to have to roll over. So the best is to try to have programs not submit between 23rd and 30th, so we have less that would roll over. But that's how it's going to happen. Next slide. So I think this is the moment where we would have all of the time for questions that is remaining on the call. I'm happy to answer any questions. Staff will field those questions, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Heimbach, for your presentation. To ask a question, you can click on the hand feature on the right-hand side of your computer screen, and we will unmute your phone line and call your name. Please also remember to unmute your own phone as well. And you can also submit a question in the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen.
All right. The first question we have is from Robert Fontana. Robert, your phone line is unmuted.
Okay. Hi, Julie. Nice presentation. The median MELD transplant for adults is calculated 250 miles from the transplant center. It doesn't, you don't account for blood group, is that right?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We thought originally that we would want to make it different for each blood group. That was what we all felt as a committee would be important. So we actually pulled the data by blood group, and it was surprisingly similar, even though we all had the expectation that it would be quite different. The exception, of course, being blood group AB, but the number of patients with that blood group was so small that calculation of the median MELD was quite problematic. The Bs in some areas also had some quite variability due to low numbers, but it was surprising how similar the A's and the O's were, so that overall it didn't really seem to be warranted to make that adjustment for that difference in blood type.
And so then when the median MELD at transplant is calculated on May 1st for a given center's patient, will it remain the same median for the next 6 months, so we'll know what to expect if we have someone with HCC or whatever, or is it going to constantly be changing?
It will stay the same for 6 months, and then when that 6 months is up, it would be recalculated. It's actually 6 months from the day of the calculation, which I think happened about 8 days ago or something. So the next one would be, exactly 6 months from the last time it was calculated, and it would be from the previous 12 months of data.
So will each center then receive what UNOS has as what our median MELD at transplant is, because it's obviously different when you take the living donors and the GCD? Will that be sent to each program?
Yes, and I actually thought it was already sent because we got ours, but maybe I can just clarify with I think it's posted, or it will be posted, and it should be sent if it hasn't already been sent.
Yeah, hi, this is Sam with UNOS Research. The median MELD at transplant document has been updated and is available on the OPTN site in the liver intestine toolkit. There hasn't been an email out to program coordinators.
The liver director's update did just go out minutes ago, actually, that has a direct link to it. So y'all should have gotten that in your email box while we've been speaking.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. And the next question we have is from Tushar Patel. Tushar, your phone is unmuted.
Dr. Patel, you may need to unmute your own phone line. We can't hear you. Well, that was the only other question we have right now. We'll wait and give him a minute to maybe unmute his own phone line. Again, if you have a question, you can click on either the hand feature or submit your question in the questions box.
And Tushar, since you work in Arizona, or in Florida, you can always email me and I'll answer it.
All right, it looks like that's all the questions that we have. There are additional resources available about the NLRB policy and guidance on the OPTN website under the resources tab, and then you would click on by organ under liver and intestine. If after this broadcast you have additional questions, you can always submit those to our members question box at memberquestions@unos.org, or call the member questions line at 844-395-4428. Just as a reminder,
sorry, Betsy, I just want to also add, if at any point anyone has questions, you can definitely reach out directly to me as well. Until July, we will actually have Dr. Rio Hirose will be the chair of the National Liver Review Board, because he's the previous chair of the Liver Committee, and I will become the previous chair of the Liver Committee in the summer, and then I will be the chair of the NLRB. And obviously, if there are any questions after the go live or in the next week or 2 weeks, and anything you want to talk about, I'm happy to talk to you at any time.
Great, thank you. Just as a final reminder, there is a town hall event for liver allocation, the new liver allocation policy tomorrow from 3 to 4 Eastern Daylight Time, and you can register for that town hall via UNOS Connect. And since we don't have any more questions, I'll just say thank you for taking the time today to attend this webinar, and I hope you have a good afternoon.